We watched him outrun a giant boulder. We watched him survive a tank going off a cliff. We even watched him survive a nuclear explosion by hiding in a lead-lined refrigerator. For over 40 years, the defining trait of Indiana Jones was that he could survive anything. But in 2023, the fedora-wearing archaeologist finally ran into something he couldn't punch, shoot, or whip his way out of: public indifference to a new Indiana Jones movie. Dial of Destiny didn't spark outrage like The Last Jedi, it just made people shrug. And that's because hardly anyone under the age of 30 went to see it, and that apathy was a death sentence. It didn't just hurt the movie at the box office, it killed the future of the franchise, with Disney scrapping a planned sequel and 2 spin-off series. For those of us who grew up with Indiana Jones, the guy's an icon, but younger audiences seem to think he belongs in a museum. And that's because somewhere along the way something went very wrong with how this franchise was managed. So to find out what went wrong, let's dive in and take a look at why nobody cares about Indiana Jones anymore. When Star Wars first hit theaters, George Lucas fled to Hawaii to get away from the stress of opening weekend, unsure if the movie would be a hit or not. He'd be joined on vacation by his friend Steven Spielberg, who was taking a break from editing Close Encounters. As the 2 most powerful filmmakers in Hollywood sat on the beach building sandcastles, Spielberg admitted something to Lucas. He wanted to direct a James Bond movie. Lucas, however, told him he had something better, and that something was Indiana Jones, a throwback to the old pulp serials Lucas grew up watching. Spielberg loved the idea, but there was a catch. Lucas told Spielberg if he wanted to direct it, he'd have to commit to 3 movies. What Spielberg didn't realize at the time was that Lucas didn't have ideas for 3 movies. In fact, he barely had an idea for 1. And that's a massive distinction with James Bond, which has dozens of Ian Fleming novels to adapt. Indiana Jones, on the other hand, doesn't. They have to make it up from scratch every single time. Even when Bond producers hit a wall or felt a franchise drifting, they had one simple rule: go back to Fleming, go back to the books. The character always had a roadmap. Spielberg and Lucas, however, never had that luxury. Not only that, after the success of the first film, it would take all 3 men, Spielberg, Lucas, and Harrison Ford, to agree on a script in order to move forward. No one person had final authority, which means progress is slow, compromises are constant, and momentum is fragile. That's why the time between each film kept getting longer and longer. Regardless, by the late 80s, Spielberg was already ready to move on. He wasn't interested in just making popcorn movies anymore. He wanted to be taken seriously, and began directing films like The Color Purple and Empire of the Sun, as he chased an Oscar. But because of that deal he made with Lucas back on the beach in Hawaii, Spielberg was obligated to direct The Last Crusade. And because of that obligation, he had to drop out of another movie he was preparing to direct, Rain Man. Unfortunately for Spielberg, Rain Man went on to win Best Picture and Best Director, as Spielberg missed out on his Oscar to make a sequel to a franchise he was already losing interest in. That's why The Last Crusade ends with Indy riding off into the sunset. It wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was Spielberg saying, "I'm done. I don't want to make any more of these." But Lucas wasn't, as he would spend years trying to convince Spielberg to come back. And this stands as an inflection point in the franchise, where 2 things should have happened. First, Lucas should have moved on from Spielberg. Terrence Young, for example, directed the first 2 Bond films before Guy Hamilton took over. And 2, they should have recast Indiana Jones. By the time all 3 men agreed to move forward with the Crystal Skull script, Ford was pushing 70. The problem is, nobody wants to see an old Indiana Jones, just like nobody wants to see an old James Bond. We saw this with Roger Moore in A View to a Kill. Moore famously said he knew it was time to quit when he found out that he was older than that Bond girl's mother. We even saw it with Connery in Never Say Never Again. The difference is both men were in their 50s in their last outing as Bond. Ford in Crystal Skull, however, was nearly 20 years older than that, and in Dial of Destiny, he was 80. But the real nail in the coffin wasn't Indy's age, it was the marriage. At the end of Crystal Skull, Indy gets married, and that's the moment Ford's Indy should have been put out to pasture. Because the entire appeal of Indiana Jones, like Bond, is that each movie is a standalone adventure. New locations, new bad guys, new love interests. You're not supposed to settle them down with a wife and watch them discuss mortgages and their 401ks. If Last Crusade should have been the end of the Ford era, Crystal Skull should have been the nail in the coffin. But Dial of Destiny took things a bridge too far, because it didn't just show us an older Indiana Jones, it showed us a broken one. We don't meet Indiana Jones in a classroom or on an adventure, we meet him sound asleep in a recliner, in a depressing apartment, yelling at his neighbors to turn down the music. He's getting divorced, his son is dead, he's an alcoholic, he's miserable. And this begs the question, who is this for? We saw the exact same thing happen to Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. We waited 30 years to see the return of the most optimistic hero in cinema history, the guy who saw good in Darth Vader when everyone else saw a monster. And what did we get? A bitter hermit drinking milk on an island, waiting to die refusing to help his friends. Hollywood keeps assuming the only way to make an older hero interesting is to humble them, break them, or strip them of everything that made them aspirational. But that's not what audiences show up for. The reason we go see Indiana Jones isn't to be reminded of the cruelty of aging. He's an escape fantasy, the guy who always makes it out alive, bruised but smiling, ready for the next adventure. If I want to go see a sad old man struggling with regret and a failing marriage, I'll go visit my uncle. So why did they never recast him? Spielberg is on record saying there's only going to be one actor playing Indiana Jones, and that's Harrison Ford. Well, Ford was even more blunt, saying, "I am Indiana Jones. When I'm gone, he's gone." But here's the irony. Harrison Ford wasn't the first choice for Indiana Jones. The role originally belonged to Tom Selleck. He even did a screen test that's available online. And honestly, he's fantastic. He had the charm, he had the look, and he would have been a brilliant Indiana Jones. The only reason we got Harrison Ford is because CBS refused to let Selleck out of his contract for Magnum PI. So the entire existence of Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones is a happy accident born from a casting dispute. The franchise literally started with a recast. Yet 40 years later, the creators have convinced themselves that the character is genetically binded to one man. And look, I get it. Nobody thought you could ever recast Sean Connery, and yet they did. Several times over now. And now everyone's got their favorite Bond. There's no reason Indiana Jones couldn't have done the same thing, other than Ford refusing to let go of the character. And let's be honest, paycheck. One of the main reasons Dial of Destiny failed was that people under 30, the most coveted demographic, didn't show up to see it. The last time Indiana Jones was in theaters was in 2008. So if you're in college right now, you were a toddler when Crystal Skull came out. That means there's now an entire generation of moviegoers who didn't grow up with Indiana Jones at all. So when Dial of Destiny rolled around in 2023, what did that generation see? A poster of an 80-year-old man holding a whip. Not exactly cool. When Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, it revolutionized cinema. Spielberg and Lucas took the pacing of old 1930s serials, where the hero was trapped in a cliffhanger at the end of every episode, and injected it into a feature film, building Raiders around one heart-stopping set piece after another, with Indy barely escaping by the skin of his teeth, constantly on the verge of death. In 1981, nobody had seen anything like this. But here's the tragedy of being a pioneer. Eventually, everyone else copies you, as that formula became the backbone of the modern blockbuster. There's a line at the end of Batman Begins where Gordon warns Batman about escalation, that once you raise the bar, the world responds by raising it even higher. And that's exactly what happened to Indiana Jones. Uncharted took Indiana Jones' DNA and dialed it up to 11, with Nathan Drake clinging to the back of a cargo plane at 30,000 feet in the air, or dangling off a train hanging over a cliff, which Mission Impossible lifted wholesale, by the way. Marvel pushed spectacle to another level. Alien armadas, nanotech suits, magic, and CGI spectacle on a massive scale. In 1981, Indy jumping from a horse onto a moving truck was heart-stopping. To today's generation, it feels quaint. Now, don't get me wrong, I fucking love Indiana Jones, and I will take a practical stunt over CGI bullshit any day of the week. But to modern audiences desensitized by CGI, Indiana Jones is an analog hero in a digital world. His films are period pieces that rely on practical stunts, and in his last two movies, he's been played by a senior citizen. That combination was never going to win over a generation that didn't grow up with him. Young audiences didn't reject Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones never spoke to them in the first place. The tragedy is it didn't have to be this way. If they had treated Indy like James Bond and rebooted the franchise in the early 2000s, they could have kept the soul of the character while updating the speed for a new generation who could have claimed him as their own. Instead, the franchise chose to look backward. And that's how Indiana Jones went from being a former king of the box office to a historical artifact. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Hollywood deep dives.